Welcome to Jesse's Flying, and today, as promised in my last video, we talk about upgrading the Mac Pro cheese grater. If you have missed that video, I strongly recommend you subscribe my channel, click the bell for notifications, because in the next video we talk about the Mac Pro 2013 trash can and its upgrading capabilities. But as this Mac here is the most upgradable Mac Apple ever created, at least in my opinion, this video could have lasted for hours because there's so much info you can find in the forums and on YouTube channels what you can do with that Mac Pro. But in this video, I'd like to focus on two things. First, a reasonable price tag for updating the Mac Pro, and second, using the latest macOS Sequoia. Maybe you've already heard that there are two packages that enable unsupported macOSs on the Mac Pro. One, obviously, is the OpenCore legacy patcher. The other one is Martin Lowe's Mac Pro package. That is the most common other package besides the OpenCore legacy patcher, but Martin Lowe's package has a specific reason. It's only for macOS Monterey, and it is not meant to install an unsupported macOS on the Mac Pros. And therefore, maybe I talk about that in a different video, but not today. Let's focus here on the OpenCore legacy patcher and on a reasonable upgrade for the Mac Pro. And as nearly all of you are using a regular PC graphics card in the Mac Pro, like this Sapphire Radeon RX 580 for instance, which is officially supported by Apple, but only until macOS Mojave. When you're using a PC graphics card, you don't have a boot selector. Otherwise, you would need a regular Apple graphics card with a flashed Apple ROM, but many of you don't have those old cards left. And so in this video, I'd like to give you a brief tutorial how to install macOS 15 Sequoia, even only with a PC graphics card, no boot selector. And that doesn't matter if you're installing it on a spinning hard disk, on an SSD, if the SSD is in an adapter PCI Express card, or if you're even using NVMe cards in the PCI Express slot. So if you're ready, let's go. So at first, let's talk about what Mac models is this video all about. There are Mac Pros 1.1 to 5.1, and this video is all about the Mac Pro 4.1 or Mac Pro 5.1, so the Mac Pro 2009 or the Mac Pro 2010 to 12. Why? Because they are technically nearly the same. The only difference is in the CPU tray. You cannot interchange the trays from Mac Pro 4.1 to 5.1 or otherwise. And if you have the dual CPU tray for the Mac Pro 4.1, Mac Pro 2009, you need thinner CPUs, you need delidded CPUs. What does that mean? That means on top of the CPU, normally there is a metal heat spreader where the name is also engraved and everything, but this has to be off for the dual CPU Mac Pro 4.1. So if you want to upgrade your Mac Pro 4.1 dual CPU, either get deleted CPUs directly or just delete them yourself. If you have a single CPU Mac Pro 4.1 or any Mac Pro 5.1, you can just use regular Intel Xeon CPUs. The fastest you can use is the Intel Xeon 5690, and this one is upgraded to the latest CPUs, dual CPU. Each CPU has 6 cores, 12 threads, so it's a total of 12 real cores, 24 threads, 3.46 gigahertz Intel Xeon Mac Pro. And if you have a Mac Pro 4.1, you can also flash the firmware to the Mac Pro 5.1. So you just cannot differentiate between your flashed Mac Pro 4.1 and the Mac Pro 5.1 only if you have a dual tray and you look under the CPU cooler if they are delidded or not. Another advantage, if you flash your Mac Pro 4.1, you can also use the 1333 MHz RAM modules instead of the 1066 MHz that the Mac Pro 4.1 was intentionally come with. So you achieve a little bit of higher memory speed. So how much memory can you put into it? If you have a single CPU Mac Pro and the CPU is only single CPU capable, because there are different Xeons, some are meant for dual CPU and some can only be used in single CPU mode. If you have that single mode CPU, the maximum is 56 GB. If you have a single CPU Mac Pro, but there is a CPU in it that could theoretically be used in a dual CPU setup, it is 64 GB. And if you have a dual CPU setup, obviously with dual CPU capable CPUs, then it's 128 GB. So that's quite a lot of RAM you could put into that old machine. Now let's talk about graphic cards. This is the original Mac graphic card that Mac Pro came with. It's an AT HD 5770, obviously from 2012. It came with two of them, but they are not metal capable anymore. So the maximum official macOS you can use is macOS High Sierra. In this video, I assume you are not willing to alter the hardware of the Mac Pro. So the fastest GPU you could use where that Mac Pro can deliver the correct amount of power for is the AMD Radeon Vega 56. But after my findings, the Vega always causes trouble. The highest graphic card I recommend is the Sapphire Radeon RX 580, which was officially supposed by Apple if you wanted to upgrade your Mac Pro from High Sierra to macOS Mojave. Why? Because macOS Mojave required a metal capable graphics card. And this graphic card works perfectly fine with the latest macOS 15 Sequoia, has graphic acceleration and is obviously metal capable. And if you are planning to upgrade your Mac Pro, you not only have to buy a new graphics card, you might have to buy some adapter cables, because this is the original adapter cable the old graphic card came with. The Mac Pro delivers the power by its back plate here, and it has two connectors and two mini 6-pin connectors like this one here. The original graphic cards came with a cable from mini 6-pin to CPU 6-pin connectors. As the RX 580 has one 8-pin connector and draws more power than the old Mac cards, I recommend you get an adapter cable, two mini Apple 6-pin connectors to one GPU 8-pin connector. So all of the power from both connectors go to the graphic card. Having said that, let's get this graphic card into the Mac Pro and let me show you how you can install macOS without the Apple boot selector, because this is a regular PC graphic card. By the way, if you already have an unsupported macOS with OpenCore Legacy Patcher installed and you want to swap the graphic cards, make sure you revert the root patch before doing that. Because how the root patch works is, it examines the hardware of your Mac, it will find the old graphic card that is still installed, and it installs graphic drivers as root patches for the old graphics card. If you just swap it against the new one, it will try to boot with the old graphic drivers for the old graphics card, and that won't work. You won't be able to boot. So revert the root patch. That is in the same menu where you can install the root patch. Shut the Mac off, swap the old card against the new one, boot macOS without root patches now, which is fine, no graphic acceleration. And now apply the root patch again, because now it will examine the hardware, will find the new graphics card and installs appropriate, completely different graphic drivers for the new card, and then make a reboot and everything should be fine. And as Apple always says, there's one more thing that you need if you want to use an unsupported macOS on this Mac Pro. You need a wired keyboard, a USB keyboard, and a USB 2.0 hub. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Why? Okay, the problem is that since macOS Ventura, Apple dropped support for the USB 1.1 controller in the Mac Pro. Okay, you say USB 1.1 controller, but you're talking about USB 2.0 controller. What's the reason behind that? The reason is simple. As long as macOS is not loaded, you have no chance to re-implement the old USB 1.1 driver. But you need the USB 1.1 driver for mouse and keyboard. So you will see that without root patches, your keyboard and your mouse Bluetooth wise won't work, because Bluetooth is also connected to the system via the USB 1.1 controller. And so your wireless keyboard and mouse won't work without root patches on the Mac Pro. Same when you try to do the recovery. The unsupported macOS don't have that drivers anymore for USB 1.1, so Bluetooth is not working, so your wireless mouse and keyboard are not working. If you plug a regular USB keyboard in, it won't work as well, because USB 1.1 drivers are missing. But the trick is, if you put a USB 2.0 hub in between, or use the keyboard with the integrated USB 2.0 hub, that forces the Mac hardware to not use USB 1.1 controller, where there are no drivers for, but to use USB 2.0 controller, which still has drivers in macOS Sonoma and Ventura. And so with that trick, a different hardware controller is used that is still supported with drivers by the macOS, and so mouse and keyboard work during updates when there's no root patch yet, or during the setup if you do that out of the recovery from the USB drive, for instance. Speaking about storage, the old spinning hard disks the Mac Pro came with are a little bit outdated right now, and the SSDs really don't cost a fortune anymore. But as you can see, the hard disks are all 3.5 inch, while the SSDs are 2.5 inch. But the solution is easy. You can see everywhere in the internet you get those 3D printed adapters that you can just install the 2.5 inch SSD into the regular trays, and you can see the SATA connectors are at the same position, so you can just take these slates and install it into the Mac Pro as with the regular hard disks. But talking about speed, the SSDs are quite faster than the spinning disks, but they really can outperform the SATA connector here, because the SATA controller is a SATA 2.0, which has a theoretical bandwidth of 300 megabytes per second. And as SSDs gets faster and faster, we might try to get a faster connection in the Mac Pro. And one of it is the PCI Express slots. The Mac Pro has a PCI Express 2.0 controller, and that has a theoretical bandwidth of 500 megabytes per second per lane. Whoa, what are lanes? You can just imagine the PCI Express as a highway, and depending on how many lanes, there's more bandwidth available. Each lane has, for instance, 500 megabytes per second. And the Mac Pro has 4 PCI Express slots. The top one have 4 lanes each. So 4 times 500 megabytes per second makes about 2 gigabytes per second bandwidth. The two bottom ones have 16 lanes. And so that's the reason why you should always try to get the graphic card into one of the bottom connectors or any card that needs high bandwidth, because that is, correct me if I'm wrong, 8 gigabytes per second. And so if we want to connect the SSD as fast as possible to the Mac Pro, we need an adapter card to get the SSD into the PCI Express. And we can use one of the top 4-lane PCI Express slots because the SSDs won't get any faster. And for instance, from OWC, you get those adapter cards. By the way, I don't get any commission for that. But that is a simple adapter card with a 4-lane PCI Express connector. And here is the connector where you can just mount the SSD. So let's see if we get the SSD that is in here and is running Sonoma right now into the adapter card into the PCI Express slot. I won't change anything. Let's see if Sonoma with the OpenCore Legacy Patcher just boots up from the adapter card or if we have to do anything to make it happen. Alright, here is the SSD on the adapter card, and let's just plug it into the Mac Pro, fire it up and see if we have to do anything or if the OpenCore boot selector will come up and it boots Sonoma. I will use one of the top PCI Express slots with 4 lanes because that's quite enough bandwidth for that SSD. Let's switch on the Mac Pro and let's see if we will see anything here on the screen. While the Mac Pro is booting, I have a quite old, slow and cheap SSD here for testing purposes. So we will see, I will show you some benchmarks afterwards, how much faster that old, slow SSD gets when you switch it from the SATA port to the PCI Express port. Oh, there it is. The OpenCore boot selector appears. There's the Apple, and obviously it is booting macOS Sonoma with OpenCore. So that was easy. We can just swap the SSD from the SATA to the PCI Express port, and there is the graphic card initialization, and there is macOS Sonoma. All right, so let's talk about benchmarks. So for benchmarking, I used the Blackmagic Disk Speed tool, and I benchmarked the exact same SSD that we just put into the PCI Express port. And this is a quite cheap SSD that I use just for testing purposes, and you can see, or you can identify cheap SSDs with low write speeds. Because for the controller in the SSD, reading is easy. They just gather the information all over the SSD and send it to the computer. But writing, the controller has to identify free spaces on the SSD and has to handle all the data. And as this is a quite cheap SSD, you can see the write speeds in the SATA port are only about 59 megabytes per second, while the read speeds are 236 megabytes per second. As I just plugged this SSD into the PCI Express port, you remember it has 4 lanes, so theoretically it can handle 2 gigabytes per second with 4 lanes. It nearly has the same write speed because that's the maximum the SSD can handle in the Blackmagic Disk Speed. But as you can see, the read speed goes up from 236 to 371 megabytes per second. That is about 135 megabytes per second more read speed just because of the adapter card and plugging it into a PCI Express port. And by the way, that adapter card is $10 to $15. if you use, or if you already have a very expensive and fast SSD, it might even boost the speed, the write and the read speed even more. But as you can see on the right side, there is even more possible. That is around 750 megabytes per second in the Mac Pro 2012. That is obviously with an NVMe. Luckily there are adapter cards. This one also is from OWC, but there are pretty much more in the internet. That is PCI Express 4 lanes to NVMe, and there is also a passive cooler included so that the airstream in the Mac Pro will keep the NVMe cool. NVMe's obviously are quite faster than SSDs, and so with that 4 lanes, just NVMe to PCI Express, I get around 750 megabytes per second. That is the reasonable price tag solution. There are cards all over the place with 2 or 4 or even 8 NVMe's in RAID with 16 lanes and so on, and you can push that up to more than 2 gigabytes or 3 gigabytes per second, but obviously this gets quite expensive. So let's see if we can just install macOS Sonoma with OpenCore Legacy Patcher, and the only thing you need for that is a USB drive that is prepared with the installer and the OpenCore Legacy Patcher. If you don't know how to do that, here is my ultimate tutorial for macOS Sonoma. Just prepare that USB drive accordingly, obviously for the Mac Pro 2012. And by the way, the NVMe I have bought here, I selected via the Mac Pro guide for the Mac Pro 2013 trash can. The link is down in the video description from Greg Grant, because this NVMe here that we're going to put into the Mac Pro 2012 is also tested and works on the Mac Pro 2013, maybe if you want to expand your internal memory. So if you haven't yet, I would recommend you subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications so you don't miss the next video that will be all about the trash can, the Mac Pro 2013, installing NVMe's with adapter cards, eGPUs, and so on. So whenever we want to install an unsupported macOS on the Mac Pro on a blank NVMe or SSD or spinning hard disk, we have no boot selector when we have a regular PC graphics card. So we have to force the Mac Pro to boot the OpenCore bootloader of the USB drive, but without seeing it in the boot selector. How do we do that? There's a simple trick, and that is we need the USB drive, plug it into the front USB port, and remove all other hard drives. There are no SATA drives, no PCI Express drives in it. And now we start the Mac and reset the NVRAM or the PRAM, which is Alt or Option key, Command R and P. And we keep those keys pressed for the first boot chime, and then we hear the second boot chime louder because the volume is also reset, and then we can get off the keys. And then the Mac Pro should search for anything to boot from, and it should find the EFI partition, the OpenCore partition of the USB drive, and should show us the OpenCore boot selector. So let's switch it on. All drives are removed. I switch on the Mac Pro and I keep Command, Option, R and P pressed, and we're waiting for the first chime, and then for the second chime to have the NVRAM reset. That was the first chime. Now we keep the keys pressed, and you can hear the fans revving up a little bit as it's resetting NVRAM. And then after a few seconds we should hear the second chime. Now that takes about 30 seconds maybe. There it is. Release the keys, and now it should boot off the USB drive of the EFI boot partition and should show us the OpenCore boot selector. Let's see if we get a picture. It takes a little while, and there is the OpenCore boot selector. And as we don't have any hard drives installed, the only option it shows is install macOS Sonoma, which is fine, which is the installer on the USB drive, but we would need the NVMe to install it to. So right now we just switch the Mac Pro off and we plug the empty NVMe into the PCI Express slot, but the Mac Pro should remember the boot option it just used, which is EFI boot of the USB drive. So let's plug the NVMe into the Mac Pro and we switch it on again. And on the screen there should be nothing different. It should just boot up, should show us the OpenCore boot selector with install macOS Sonoma, which is on the USB drive. But in the setup, we should be able, there is the boot chime, we should be able to select the NVMe drive as a target disk to install Sonoma on. So let's wait if we see the boot selector. Should come up every second. There it is. And we say install macOS Sonoma. And I just speed up the video a little bit. Let's install Sonoma on the NVMe drive. And here you can see the installer found the NVMe drive, and you can select the NVMe as a target disk to install macOS Sonoma on. And while the macOS installer is installing Sonoma on the NVMe, let's talk a little bit more about some more benchmarks. Comparing the SSD in the SATA port in the PCI Express slot against the NVMe in the PCI Express slot. I used Amorphous Diskmark for that because this software can simulate either sequential read and write or random read and write, and all that with either one thread or 8 threads. Whoa, 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 what's all that? Sequential read or write is when the data starts at one point on the SSD or on the NVMe and the controller can just read or write the whole data one after another until it's finished. Random means the data is scattered all over the place, and the controller needs to get some data here, to get some data there, and to get some data there, and it always checks where is the next piece of data. That obviously requires more time, and that's why random read and write tests are way slower than sequential, obviously. And then the software can either simulate one thread, so that is only one program requiring data or wanting to write data, or 8 simultaneous requests of data or of writing data. So when we check the benchmarks, you can see the SSD connected via SATA has write speeds about 200 megabytes. No big difference between 8 or one thread. And the read speeds, also here 8 threads a little bit faster, 290 nearly, and the read speed with one thread 260. If we just swap that SSD to a PCI Express slot, you can see that the write speeds bump up a little bit from around 200 to around 230, but the read speeds go up 460 to 540. That's double the speed just by plugging it into the PCI Express port. And obviously the very fast NVMe reaches speeds between 650 and 830 megabytes per second. So that's a huge increase when you exchange the SSD against the NVMe. As the Mac Pro is still installing, let's talk about another useful upgrade, and that is USB 3.0. as the Mac Pro only has USB 2.0, and that's quite a speed difference. But what is the speed you can expect? So USB 3.0 generation 1, as this card is here for instance, has a theoretical throughput of 5 gigabit per second, which is 625 megabytes per second. In real life, you will get around 200 megabytes per second due to the latency of the controller and all that other stuff that is involved. And if you ramp up to USB 3.0 generation 2, that has a theoretical throughput of 10 gigabit per second, which is 1250 megabytes per second. In real life, you may end up around 700 megabytes per second. But that is not for the simple USB sticks that you maybe use for installing macOS. That is more speed for an external USB NVMe drive or something like that. And so, as the Mac Pro has PCI Express 2.0, we already learned that the maximum throughput here is 500 megabytes per second per lane. So if you have a PCI Express card that uses 4 lanes, 2 gigabytes per second throughput, that is way enough for a USB 3.0 Gen 2 card. And what cards or what chipsets do work with the macOS and the Mac Pro? With most of the offers on Amazon or eBay, they already write works with macOS or works for the Mac Pro. Here I have a simple $10 USB 3.0 Gen 1 card that has USB Type A and Type C external connectors, and also 2 internal connectors that has the chip, the FL1100 for USB 3.0 generation 1. If you want to buy a generation 2 chip, and there are all variants of cards like with different amounts of connectors and so on, you may have a look out for the ASM3142 chip that is very common and works out of the box with macOS and the Mac Pro, and this is USB 3.0 generation 2. And as you can see, while I was filming this video, Apple released macOS 15 Sequoia, and all my other videos had to be done first. So I can assure you, macOS Sonoma installation on the Mac Pro just ran through without any issues. And here in my Sequoia video, I show you the update process of the Mac Pro 2012 from Sonoma to Sequoia. And right now I'm in full swing of testing Mac Pro, Cheese Grater, and all my other Macs with macOS Sequoia. And I'm working on a dedicated video to show you what are the issues and what are the problems maybe with the latest macOS. And thank you so much for all your feedback in the comments below the video and on my Discord server. And so if you are planning to install macOS Sequoia or already are running macOS Sequoia on an unsupported Mac, that's a good idea to join my Discord server, to join our Discord community. It's more than 2,500 members discussing every aspect and every little detail about unsupported Macs with macOS Sequoia. Little sneak peek, iPhone mirroring can only work when you have a T2 security chip installed in your unsupported Mac. So check that before asking for iPhone mirroring, that the feature doesn't work. For instance, it won't work on the Mac Pro 2012 or 2013. So thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next video. macOS Sequoia tested for a few weeks on all kind of unsupported Macs. Happy upgrading your cheese grater, and obviously the next video in that series, does it really make any sense, is the Mac Pro 2013 trash can. So stay tuned. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye bye.